First, I just want to say thank you again for joining us today. My name is Ray Boyle. I am the interim program director at Build It Green, as well as a board member, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you all. Thanks for joining us for our conversation on developing environmentally responsive building approaches. And just quickly to our audience, thank you for sharing a part of your afternoon with us. You probably have very busy schedules and might be zoomed out, so we really appreciate you taking the time. In order to make this as engaging as possible, we're inviting you to put your questions in the Q&A during the presentation, and we will work to get to as many of them as possible at the end. Yeah, just have a running dialogue. Of course, there'll be time at the end as well for you to put them in there if you've had to percolate on it a bit. Quick context setting. This is the 4th installment of Build It Green's Fall Forum series. Through these online dialogues, Build It Green has been working with our community to identify new ways to catalyze building culture toward regenerative design and development. In taking a systemic approach, we saw ADUs as kind of the right unit of scale to explore the intersection between finance, policy, building materials, community, workforce development, but really all nested in this bioregional revitalization. To deepen our understanding, together we are bringing together stakeholders and innovators across the field to explore new potential, highlight existing successes, and really work to identify the gaps that the Build It Green community can uniquely play a role in filling. So what is our unique role in this space? So far, we've explored catalyzing new markets for construction and building materials. We've looked at construction productivity and reduced construction costs. We have started to look at alternative financial products, ownership models and services that increase access to building affordable homes. And today we're looking beyond sustainable practices of measuring impact or sustainable materials doing less harm toward revitalizing the environments in which these materials are sourced and where they spend their lives and where they end up at the end. We want to create healthy green homes, of course, but we also think we need to be focusing on thriving communities and a thriving planet. And is that possible? So today we welcome 3 very different perspectives on sustainable materials and their applications. Hopefully they'll have some really great ideas about how we can move beyond sustainable into regenerative. It's on you guys. Our guests today are Massey Burke, the co-director of California Straw Building Association, which is a 24-year-old building professional nonprofit organization working with cities, counties, and the state to make building with straw bales an accepted form of construction through California. Massey, thanks for being with us. David Marr is a structural engineer and owner of Marr Design, an award-winning mission-driven firm on the forefront of performance-based seismic design and sustainable design. Thanks, David. And we also have Cash East. He's the director of analytics for HIGCO, which is a technology company on a mission to deliver a common language for sustainability measurement for consumer goods industries to empower businesses to make meaningful improvements that protect the well-being of factory workers, local communities, and the environment. Thanks, Cash, for being with us. And just before we get into the good stuff, we want to take a very quick poll to see who's joining us today. You'll see a pop-up screen. Well, you should see a screen pop up on your computer. Please select up to 2 roles you most closely identify with. This helps us get to know you a little bit better and also make sure that some of our responses are meeting you where you're at. All right, 50% green building consultants with us. Thank you so much for being with us. You are our tried and true community. After that, looks like it's a pretty solid distribution, real estate being next, and nonprofit advocates. Awesome, thanks for being here. Developers and builders, city officials, planners, architects, designer, homeowners, wonderful. No manufacturers and suppliers on the call today. Interesting. Thank you all so much for being here. And we hope that this next hour will provide some value to you in your life. Let's get started. So for those of you who are in California, not all of us even on the call today are in California, but for those of you who are, you know that we are hopefully at the end of, but likely in the middle of one of the worst fire seasons in history. Already more than 4 million acres have burned, of which more than 1.1 million are federally managed forests. 9,200 structures have been burned, and Santa Rosa, who's still recovering from the 2018 firestorms, lost 8,000 homes that are still in a backlog for being built. All of this is having a hefty toll, obviously, on the environment itself. It's exacerbating the housing crisis, as well as increasing the cost of materials dramatically. Since March of this year alone, the cost of lumber has gone up by 120%. Now, obviously, that's due to a bunch of different factors, but that's massive. That's added a staggering $16,000 to a single family unit in just lumber costs. So when we're thinking about this, we have to also think about new ways to build these homes. In some corners of the world, there's been talk of reincorporating indigenous land management practices and thinning forests to help protect from these fires, revitalize ecosystems, and possibly provide a new source of responsibly sourced timber. We think that ADUs are somehow the right size to start experimenting with alternative building methods, alternative sourcing methods, and new ways into the code. Massey, within that context, you are an expert in alternative and natural building materials. They come from, where they're sourced. How is CASBA thinking about these issues? How can these materials translate into backyard accessory dwelling units?
Thank you, Ray. Yeah, so I'm the co-director of the California Straw Building Association, and the materials that I work with and the methods that I work with, both through the nonprofit and also in my own practice, are both very new but also very old. So it seems a bit much to call myself an expert, because all of this work is the cutting edge of a 10,000-year-old building tradition. But there are some of us who are relearning and reincorporating how to work with natural materials, traditional materials. This happens a lot in the nonprofit space right now because of the materials are just that. They're not products. They are straw, clay, hemp, bamboo, going directly to what products are made from, rather than necessarily developing a specific product. So it's processes. And it's also what I call open source building, so it's nobody owns these ways of building, but they are being expanded, in some ways updated, you could say. So CASBA plays a big role, not only for straw bale building, but just for building with straw in general and complementary materials. And as I mentioned, I also am a practitioner of natural building, hands-on, and also researching carbon footprinting and other related technical issues around natural materials, which again is mostly nonprofits. In the sort of more conventional building sphere, that would be company product driven. In our world, it's nonprofits. So, and so what does that look like? There's kind of a long-standing joke in the natural building movement, which is that we don't really like the name because it's vague, but nobody has yet thought of a better one. And so what that looks like is building with sustainably grown, at least FSC or better lumber, insulating with plant-based, annually renewable insulation, and in some cases you can construct a whole building out of annual plant-based walls, straw, bamboo, and then finishing with often a clay or lime composite or other low carbon surface ways of making surfaces. These are environmental in part because they can help reconnect us to the ecosystems that make them, which I'll talk, I think, more about a little later. But also they're just very, natural materials are they're carbon sequestering or low carbon. And so by sort of more conventional environmental metrics, they're just very low impact.
And how can these particular materials start to relate to ADUs in the conversation that we're talking about?
You mean just physically, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, in terms, we've talked a little bit about using these for large structures or small. What is the scale or the relationship between the materials and the scale of the ADU specifically? Are they like the right sized materials for this particular structure, or is there something else that we should be considering?
Well, I mean, this is just my particular lens, and so I tend to answer your question more, how do you incorporate natural materials in an ADU? But yeah, I think the one consideration is that when you're using bio-based insulation, you tend to use thicker walls. And so that's something that would be probably a specific consideration for ADUs and scale. But in most other senses, it's a perfect match. And also, I'd say it's a good match for where the community/industry is at, because we are looking for what scaling up is, especially in the urban fabric right now. And so ADUs are a great place to continue that process.
Great, thank you so much. I just got a vision of one of my favorite new books is Low Tech. I'm sure you know it and love it. But just thinking about all of the houses that I used to drive by in South Africa that were small and round and built from clay and straw. And it was just the right size for that scale. And so I'm reflecting on all those pictures that are running through my head right now. Thank you. So you just shared a lot about the materiality itself, right? And to just touch very briefly on the carbon storing potential of these earth-based products. Cash, I want to talk to you a little bit. HIGCO has created a suite of products actually to measure the carbon impact of the materials that Massey was just discussing, and so many more, tracing where they're sourced all the way to end of life. How do you even begin to measure all of these different types of products with so many different variables, and then to bring them together into a tool that actually helps customers or product developers, kind of a little bit more to Massey's point, these are just materials and then they turn into products. How do you help people make these more sustainable choices?
Sure, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's certainly a pretty large undertaking, and it has been an evolution over time. The HIG MSI, or the Material Sustainability Index, is a database of materials, including the underlying processes that helps product designers, brands, manufacturers make better choices about the materials that they're using, specifically from a sourcing point of view. The MSI has been through a lot of a series of revisions. It was started many years ago by Nike and by the Outdoor Industry Association. So it's evolved from a complex spreadsheet of aggregation of a lot of data, and over the years through our work with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which is a nonprofit made up of industry, data providers, service providers, and other environmental experts. Throughout 10 years of not only the materials tools, but the facilities tools and the brand levels tools, and our users and our stakeholders helping to make that data better. We source data from all over the world. We try to use the best available, most statistically sound data. And one of the strengths of the MSI is that we bring this data in from studies from all over the world. We get stuff from academics, industry associations grant us access to their data, but we take it all and we put it into a single database. And that becomes really helpful because it gives people a guided way to start assessing the impacts of those materials. And really, I think you make a good point about the difference between the materials and the products that they go into. And that's really a key point of life cycle assessment, or LCA, which is really what we base that is our methodology. We are a life cycle database. Understanding the function and the context of those materials is such a critical piece of this. Understanding not only the upstream impacts and the carbon footprint, the embodied carbon footprint, we track biogenic carbon and water scarcity, number of different impact areas, but understanding what those materials mean in the context of the product. So specifically, let's say for apparel or footwear, how does using more durable materials that add lifetime to the product affect the overall carbon footprint or water footprint or whatever it may be that a company is looking at? How does the durability affect the end of life and the recyclability of it? So it's really about providing tools that have this life cycle and system perspective where you can take the context of that material and its use and understand it in a consistent framework. And I think that's That's one of the exciting things about working with it is it's not a static database. We're always looking to add new information. And being in apparel and footwear, we cover a lot of materials, so we're constantly on the search and working with brand partners and manufacturing partners to get the best available data, and many times getting primary data from manufacturers to recognize some of these new innovations that are on the marketplace.
Thank you so much. I have a few questions percolating in my mind that I'll save to the end as well around data sources and how to normalize the kind of stuff across different inputs, but we'll get there. So it sounds like there's certainly a lot of differentiation between the areas that are measured by the Material Sustainability Index, MSI, but a lot of it measures the impact on the environment, right? Not necessarily the social outcomes or environmental outcomes at the source, right? I would love to kind of unpack a little bit more. What are some of the tensions and trade-offs between products and weighing sustainability? A little bit on the tail end of what you were sharing, durability versus what it's made out of, but also the limitations of these types of measurement tools when we're really considering sustainability and resilient design and development.
Yeah, so I mean, that's one of the things we constantly talk about and think about is, how do we make sure that we're considering a range of environmental impacts and understanding the trade-offs that you're making between, maybe a reduced carbon footprint for an increased water footprint, or how does a low carbon and low weight material translate into performance aspects. So balancing those trade-offs is a core tenet of what we do, and that's why we present more than just carbon impacts. We present carbon impacts, water scarcity, total water withdrawal, water quality, total energy demand, as well as biogenic carbon. And understanding how all those things not only play against each other from a material point of view, but how they start to play against each other when you're using them in a product are really key pieces of this. And there are certainly limitations, and there are certainly areas where we're looking to grow. LCA is a very quantitative format. It's very, it really likes to be in sort of process level engineering. We like to be able to count carbon molecules going in and out, and energy flows. So that makes some of the environmental impacts, say biodiversity or impacts on communities, that don't lend themselves readily to quantitative metrics. Those are a challenge for us. And so thinking about ways to take the LCA framework and the systems thinking perspective and back it out a little bit and say, okay, well, how can we bring in some things that are far more complex? I mean, natural systems, we deal with this in agricultural based products are, I mean, they're essentially impossible to model exactly. And so understanding what you're seeing and what you're not, and then trying to apply those frameworks in a more broad way. So you're identifying areas to bring it in. Social impacts are a big area where we're trying to bring in, how do you understand the impact on communities that these supply chains have? Certainly an area we've got a lot of room to grow in.
I think, would you say that that's kind of a main area? If you look across LCAs, generally, would you consider that kind of a main area where a lot of these things fall down? Is that even though they're taking this advanced system scale approach, looking really on the ground impact or of the sourcing is kind of a hole in that market?
Absolutely.
Would you say? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, regionality is always a challenge for us.
Yeah.
We tend to fall back on carbon quite a bit because it is the most global of our impacts. A kilogram of CO2 emitted essentially anywhere in the world is going to have generally the same impact. That is not true for water quality or water withdrawal, and certainly very different in terms of new supply chains opening up in new areas and the impact that may have on both natural systems and on local communities. So the regionality of it is always a challenge in getting that accurate data. And there are certainly a lot of people doing a lot of good work in the social LCA world and trying to understand social impacts, but within that quantitative framework. And we're excited about continuing to expand in that area.
Great, thank you so much. More food for thought. So, I mean, David, you know plenty about the importance of these technical measurements and being able to get down to the very the tiniest details make the difference in your world. I can't even imagine what nth of a percentile measurements you're into. But you've somehow been able to combine the analytical approach of engineering with the use of natural materials and environmental, like very specific place-based environmental responsiveness to create magnificent structures that withstand the test of time. What kind of tensions exist between these traditional structurals that we're talking about, traditional structural engineering, and some of these load testing for bio-based materials? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you approach those tensions in your work.
Sure. So in our practice, we focus on kind of innovations at lots of different scales. We do some big fancy stuff, and then I like working on kind of little fun projects. I think one of the biggest things is that in traditional engineering, there's a culture and there's a way we've been taught, and there's a standard way we see the world. And I found it really helpful, especially in my explorations in natural building, is to kind of listen to builders and kind of try to understand, like almost like a physical bodily sense of what's going on. As someone where folks are actually working with materials. And I think a lot of things you're talking about with ADUs are really appropriate, because it's a small scale that is almost human scale, like builders can pick up the materials, like we can handle it. It's not like a high rise where human scale sort of doesn't make any sense. And so I think there's a need to like culturally divorce ourselves or open up almost like these soft skills of listening and learning how construction happens in a simpler form and a more nuanced scale. And then kind of like suspend all the stuff you know about math and physical models a little bit to open up to seeing sort of different behaviors. So that's a sort of long, weird answer.
I cannot tell you how much I love that answer. I'm thinking about suspending our belief in mathematical systems while we're building, and my mind is breaking as you're speaking. But I mean, it's important, and I think it sort of opens up our imaginations for something else that's kind of that can emerge. Maybe we can go a little bit more into that. You can unpack that for us. When we were first preparing for this conversation, you said you wanted to get rid of engineering as a barrier to entry. And that there's this continuum between craftsmanship and hard engineering, which in its own way is a craft or a culture, kind of what you were talking about. But when it comes to increasing the capabilities and the capacities of homeowners themselves in designing their spaces, how do new ways of building and perhaps natural building materials contribute to removing some of those barriers and help while also maintaining structural integrity? So bringing back, taking our mathematical models out of suspension and bringing them back in to the conversation. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that continuum and then reducing engineering as a barrier to entry.
Sure. Well, like I've done a lot of work in the straw bale world, and I really love the tradition of workshops and seeing people do work with their hands. And I've sort of picked up on that thread and done like field testing, like working on a design and actually try to do a little teeny experiment. Like try something, like listen to a suggestion of a builder and then set up an experiment. And you can do it sort of at a small enough scale. Like we did a load test of a vault for a roof, and after the test was over, I had a whole bunch of people pile on the vault, like climb up on it. And that was a gravity load test. And it was good enough for the job that it was doing. And so we kind of like not getting stuck on precision and understanding like the job things that products need to do. So I just think there's so much to learn from like the physical touching and feeling and experimenting with materials and getting a sense of how robust they can be versus an idea of rather than looking at them for what they're not, sort of try to accept them as they are. So I've done load tests where I've designed a straw bale wall and then it quote unquote failed in the lab, but then kept working as we kept running the experiment. And it completely blew my mind as to what was going on. And you could get insights that you could extrapolate in all other types of materials because there were behaviors that I wasn't anticipating and I wasn't, but they did show up and they do exist. And there's a lot of really important study right now figuring out like why little buildings are really safe. Like we've got fancy models and we're just getting to the point where we're trying to understand that small little buildings have a hard time hurting people. That means there's a lot more flexibility. There's a lot more space to try things. And so one of the things I want to do is have the formality of traditional engineering not be in the way of people building.
Thank you so much. If I had an award for the most poetic engineer I've ever met, I would hand that over to you right now. Unfortunately, I don't have that with me. Thank you for just painting such a beautiful picture with your words and coming from the space of engineering, making these, like illuminating the intangible in a way that gives them their own sense of self, their own veracity, their own validity, without needing to be measured or molecularized, if that's a word. So Massey, this has been quite a journey, and we've been talking a lot about bio-based materials, natural building systems, and some of their environmentally restorative features like carbon sequestration and renewable harvesting. I just want to tie into David's comment. I'm just thinking about this load testing of these people piling on. First of all, I hope they signed waivers. Second of all, I think it speaks to kind of a little bit of the answer of this question I would like to ask you. How do these materials and the resulting structures and processes to build them help shape the communities and places in which they're built?
I mean, I think David began to capture that really well, and it's why I've taken time over the years to talk with him. So much of my knowledge of materials comes from working with them, you know, and what's great about, I think what drew me, 20 years ago in my impressionable 20s to start learning hands-on how to build with this stuff was that you can go, you go into the field and you dig up clay, and it tells you to a very great degree what to do with it, how to process it, like what kind of wall that particular clay soil is going to be suited for. And when David and I first spoke, what was so great about that conversation was the two ends coming together, because really my favorite thing in all of this is messing around with materials. Like, it's just so empowering. And I guess the reason I wanted to pick up on what David was saying is that, first of all, it's really great to have engineers, for those of us who are hands-on, but like to express and come to understand what's going on more technically. It helps us a lot. And the two-way conversation is really just cool. And also, both of the tests that David described and, the concept of listening to materials is one of the most empowering things about these materials. And so they have there's a couple things that I think are I forget exactly how you put the question, but just if we're speaking to regenerative community impacts, one is literally the direct relationship with the materials and making choices around them, and having that choice making and that building process be accessible. And that is particularly true of some of these vernacular building techniques, even in their modern form. They're just easier to work with. They're more incremental. You don't have to be crazy strong for that process to be accessible. And so suddenly you have this opportunity for a much wider swath of the community to be involved in homemaking, housemaking, not practical to build skyscrapers, but that's mostly not what we're building anyway, you know? And maybe it is, I don't know, I'm making assumptions, but possibly less practical to build skyscrapers, but we're mostly dealing with 1- and 2-story residential construction, you know, that's where the high impacts are. Certainly in sort of re-empowering communities. And the other thing that I think this is maybe what instinctively drew me to natural building it to begin with, but I'm only really learning how to talk about it now, is that when you have these, you know, if you're working with materials that are, they have what I like to call ecosystem-based supply chains. I mean, in some sense, everything is an ecosystem-based supply chain, but what I mean is most of the process that makes that material is an ecosystem. It's not a factory. It means that you have really short supply chains. What's going on is reasonably transparent if you want to pay attention. And it's also accessible, especially if you're looking at bioregional sizes of supply chains, which is pretty practical for most non, you know, intensively industrial materials, you know, straw, wood, depending on where you are for wood, I guess. Just a lot of the other natural materials that I've talked about, which means that then communities that are in that bioregion are much more empowered to make choices around how those supply chains are managed. And now we're, I would say, really relearning, because most regenerative land management has its origins in many old cultures around the world. And I feel there's always more to learn, you know, so I would say that we're relearning regenerative agriculture and forest management, but even through the relatively sort of constricted lens of carbon, human interaction and human choices can create a carbon storing supply chain for straw that goes into a building. So not only is there biogenic straw stored in the building, there is the carbon stored in the soil of the field that made that straw, depending on how you manage that field. And so we have this huge range of choices that are very accessible compared to trying to like influence the global cement supply chain. Right? Like, where are you going to start with that? You know, just not accessible and really complicated, and actually probably less complicated than even some other things. And so I think not that everything has to be built this way, but I think the lens, going back to the beginning and kind of rethinking how we want supply chains to work for the built environment, and also as an urban person or a person who practices in the urban fabric, like, if we're going to respond to climate change, the tool we have is built environment. You know, so how does that then begin to radiate out into other areas around us? How do we use the built environment as a driver to respond to climate change most effectively? And so I think that has to be, that goes beyond buildings into supply chains, which I find really exciting.
Thank you. I know that we prepared for this, but I am just so blown away by this conversation. Thank you all so much. I have one last question for all of you that I try and stay away from these everybody answer. So because we have to keep them a little bit shorter. But you know, we've looked at building systems. We've looked at how we measure materials. We've looked at the materials themselves. We've suspended belief on mathematics and engineering, just to come all the way back to jumping on houses together and doing load tests. Intangibles. So we've covered a lot of ground, but what are some of the tangible ways that you today in your current work is helping mainstream these ideas? Mostly what I really want to get at though is what's missing in terms of trying to get this stuff more mainstream, that if it were present, it would make a huge difference. This is sort of open it. Whoever wants to, David, maybe we'll start with you, and then we'll go over to Cass, and Massey will give you a little bit of time there.
Yeah. Well, I think especially in the kind of ADU space, I would love to see like little packets of free engineering kind of given out to the community. Like the California Earthquake Authority and FEMA have free retrofit plans for homes. And so they spent a little bit of money to develop some nice detailed solution. And the idea is a homeowner can just work with their contractor and they can bypass the engineer. So they're, you know, at the scale of an ADU, you can develop really simple span tables to pick materials. You can get lateral systems by little off the shelf pre-manufactured walls. So that could be like a little dense, very appropriate point for some pre-engineering, but it's been tested and you can plug it in.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that you can liberate the rest of the house or the building process from all of these kind of other constraints.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think finding kind of these right or appropriately sized packets of engineering that can be, again, given away would be a nice start.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have another thing is I think for the most part, we are at that scale, most buildings are way too strong, stronger than they need to be. I had a friend who did a shake table test at UC San Diego. He leads the Stanford engineering department, and they did a wood frame, 2-story wood frame house with sheetrock and glue, like liquid nails. So no real nails, no straps, no nothing. And the thing did really, really well. And I developed like the FEMA retrofit guidelines for weak story buildings. And one of the big insights is we learned how to count finishes.
Mm.
And by counting all this stuff that exists that is normally not thought of, you can find all this extra capacity that is out there. So I do really believe in this stuff and like learning how to see what's there. So there's some things that I do kind of like really working at the scale that I think could be really practical.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm sure Cash would be more than happy to help analyze all of the
Yes.
It goes into each one of those small little packets. Cash, you, please.
Yeah, so I think we tend to be extremely focused on the data and the numbers and sound mathematical models as a part of really the body of work that we deliver. But one thing that's a fairly common theme, and it trips a lot of people up, is having a values system that helps guide you around what are you placing importance on. The amount of potential information out there and the way you consider it and the different impacts, it almost has this deer in headlights effect with people when you present them with this much information. And it's so important for people to really, take stock, take an inventory of the values systems that they're trying to promote. And often, especially when we first start working with companies to do this, that's a pretty serious challenge. What are the common values that we have? Are we just focused on a purely carbon analytical number? How do our employees or people that are interacting with our products or in the manufacturing of our products, what are we trying to do to promote well-being in that environment, and what do we want from our customers? What values do we want to sort of instill in the way we make our products to pass those values on to our customers? So I think the definition of that values system, even in a heavily quantitative field like LCA, is really, really important to have the kind of guiding guiding principle behind why you care about the things that you're bringing into your system and what impacts you're actually trying to solve for. And that's often a very, very hidden and somewhat surprising piece of work that people have to do when they first start their journey. And then David, just to expand on something that you said about all of the extra things that build up when you're looking at this. I mean, that's a very common occurrence for us. We'll focus on, or we'll see a company come in and focus on, we're looking for a better cotton supply chain, or we want to look at plant-based alternatives to leather, or whatever it may be. If you don't consider sort of that, take that lens back a little bit, there's so many things you can miss. You can miss the from a quantitative point of view, the transportation legs back and forth, the additional packaging, how consumers and how the product exists in its use phase. So considering that broad lens and defining that value system, they're really critical components of a good sustainability and values-based system that often gets overlooked. So I think those are both things that certainly resonate in our industry as well.
Great, thank you. Massey,
Oh.
round us out.
Was that
David?
Dave was going to say something?
Oh, I was going to say, Cash, one of the things that I really appreciated you talking about earlier was the choice of durability and just thinking about how important it is to understand the job that materials need to do, and how strong they need to be, or how weak can they be, and what the impact is. And I really appreciate like all of that consideration that has to go into these choices. And appreciate your work, because it's almost like there's an environmental karma that you're describing for us as we make choices. And I think people with more choice will make better choices if we understand sort of what the impacts are. So thanks.
Yeah, just to build on that as well. And Cash, it's really fun to get to know your work. One thing that CASBA is in the middle of, or I should say I'm in the middle of as a part of CASBA, is looking at how to create an LCA for straw, probably straw bale, though there's still some discussion around like what's the right unit, LCA EPD. And I think in the biggest picture, quantification is an issue. And I think it's particularly an issue for some of the best materials and techniques, because they're not, what characterizes an ecosystem friendly approach to something is co-benefits. So you do one thing and you get 5 unexpected benefits, you know, and this has been the best description that I know of this right now is in Drawdown, the book Drawdown by Paul Hawken. And he doesn't address it too directly, I think, except in the introduction, where he says basically, it was really interesting. So Drawdown is, you know, a summary of 80 of our most powerful tools for addressing removing carbon dioxide, climate change, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And he said what was so surprising even to him was that they weren't like big technical things. You know, a lot of it's land management, a lot of it's, you know, refrigerators, or I mean, just like a lot of very daily types of things. But he said what also characterized most of the approaches is that not only did they address climate change, but they addressed a lot of the resiliency issues that come along with climate change or are a result of other things. And so co-benefits is, I think, the most typical way to describe that, but it's really hard to capture that in an LCA form, you know. And one thing I'd really like to figure out how to do, may not be possible in my first stab, you know, how in the world do I capture regenerative supply chains in an LCA? You know, how do you reorient that technical document to reflect that reality? You know, so I think that's a challenge with really, truly sort of socially responsible and ecologically responsible approaches. The other thing, just for my kind of particular lens or skill set, is labor. You know, so the strength and the challenge of a lot of these very basic ecological building techniques is that they're labor intensive. You know, so that is a strength from certain perspectives, and it's obviously a challenge in other ways. And so just reorienting how we think about and design for labor, I think there is actually a lot of opportunity there, but it's also a challenge.
Yeah, especially today's construction labor market in California.
Right.
So I want to open up to a couple of audience questions before I come back with our little lightning round. And please, if you are in the audience and have more questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll be following those along. Cash, for you, this question: is there a good online source that has the MSI database available for designers and architects, or is it all proprietary? Tell us. How can we get it?
Sure. So we do have a public side of the MSI. So yeah, this is always a balance that we have in getting high quality data that is actively managed. Is, you know, it costs money, and there's a whole infrastructure behind getting all of that together, balanced with, you know, providing that information out to people. You know, and somewhat selfishly, you know, the more access that people have, the better data that we get, and the more feedback that we get. So we do have a public side of the site. You just apply for an account, and then you get access into some pieces of the data, not everything. So yeah, I'd be happy to provide that information. That
would be great. And if, while I'm asking Massey a question, you could throw that in the chat for everyone, that would be wonderful. And Massey, how do, and maybe David, you might have something to say about this as well. How do nature-based materials influence the indoor environmental quality? including temperature, stability, and comfort. Thank you, Sarah Slaughter. Happy to have you with us today. Fellow advisory council member, always throwing in the good questions. But yeah, how do these nature-based materials influence the indoor environmental quality, temperature, stability, and comfort?
Generally pretty well. So hi, Sarah. Great to see you. Yeah, so well-insulated buildings, including those insulated with natural materials, tend to be very quiet and temperature stable. In very general terms, and I'm sure most of our audience is aware of this, the best indoor thermal performance tends to come from a combination of good insulation and thermal mass. And most of the time, though not all the time, natural materials are finished with some kind of a plaster, exterior, interior, which tends to be a bit more massive than like a sheetrock finish. And so you, generally speaking, you're going to get a pretty good combination of those two qualities for thermal. And then one of the cool things about clay in particular is that it tends to balance, it has a particular relationship with water and water vapor. And so it tends to balance indoor air humidity as well. Sort of a quality that's particular to clay-based materials. And then there's, this is a little bit less quantified, but there seems to be evidence that clays can help with other types of toxin loads in indoor air quality. And so generally very beneficial.
Great. David, any input from you on that question?
Massey's like so smart. That's like great. Thanks.
Look who's talking.
I know. This is like a real all-star panel. So let's just say if I were a homeowner and I'm, you know, I've suspended now all of my belief in engineering. I have looked online and I know where my materials are sourced and I know exactly the carbon footprint my house can have. Where do I go to start using these natural building materials and source them and build them?
It depends a lot on where you are and what you're building, you know, so our challenge right now is scaling up, and a lot of that has to do with workforce development. So I would say if you want to do it tomorrow, go find yourself a building class. If you're in California, there are also a decent number of contractors around who are familiar with these techniques. But what we need right now is to grow the skill set. That's one of the main things we need. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And we are super close to the end. So I would like just to ask a couple of hot seat questions that I've been thinking about as we were talking today. And Cash, I want to start with you. It's a little bit in relation to the last question that we asked you, and you talked about having essentially values-led LCAs. And much more than that, right? But presenting your values. I couldn't help but think whose values and the importance of really understanding the positionality of whose values you're putting in front. So who determines the value? What is the makeup of those people? And what does that mean in terms of the implication it has on the life cycle analysis that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, making externalities internalities. So how do you identify new management tools that allow you to look at things or understand things in a way that may not have been available to you? And it's, I mean, honestly, it can become this sort of infinite growing circle of like, well, you know, what are we considering in our value system, and you know, how do we put the tools together in a manageable way? So you know, it often starts fairly narrowly, and that is a reaction in a lot of places that, you know, hey, it's too much to design a program that's sort of gonna solve everything. So we're gonna start with, you know, a carbon commitment. We're gonna look at how do we decarbonize our supply chain. And as a result of that, you know, especially in the supply chain relationships and the manufacturing partner relationships, breaking down those silos of communications, and even in competitive environments, you know, we have we have hundreds of competitors that are, competing with each other every day to sell, more t-shirts or more running shoes or whatever it is, that are coming together in pre-competitive areas to kind of try to define some of these value sets. And it leads to some really tough conversations sometimes, honestly. And it's very, very clear, especially when you're looking at the data, that different organizations and different value sets will lead to very different outcomes. So yeah, I mean, that's a really tricky question, and I don't think I have a perfect answer for that one. But an evolution of the value systems that you have, I think, is the most important piece of this. And I think anybody who's gone into an LCA or any sort of quantitative metrics know that they'll answer a few questions, but they're probably going to bring up a bunch more questions as you're moving forward. And Massey, a couple of things you said earlier, I think that are really important to think about how we expand and grow these. Your example of regenerative soil and soil carbon. An LCA modeler will instantly think, okay, well, how do I put that into something where I can manage it? So that means that I've got to know where it came from. I've got to know how long that farm has been around. I've got to know that they're going to keep being around and they're going to keep doing all of these things. Oh yeah, we've also got to figure out how to measure the effectiveness of building soil carbon through things like no-till or crop rotations or whatever it is. So you get into these areas where it's not a single place you end up. It's a journey, and it changes, and successes should lead to more opportunities for improvement. So yeah, I mean, it's a moving target.
Yeah.
And in case you're interested, there are people in the regenerative ag world who are doing that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And yeah, there's a lot of interest in measuring and starting to measure things like that.
Yeah. And there's such a thing as an evolving soil carbon market,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of debate as well as whether that's a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a lot there to unpack, and I just think about who is traditionally at the front of sustainability movements in America, and who is at the front of these conversations versus who has been doing it for hundreds of years, and the disparity there, and how we can elevate existing voices, elevate existing land management practices, center marginalized voices, and know that we're repeating some of the values that have been held for much longer than we have come up with them, and finding ways to really make that clear in terms of whose values we're representing. So thank you. It is a tricky question that is hopefully what these little hot seat questions are designed for. Massey, quick one for you, which is it's unfortunately like kind of pedestrian, but I do wonder, and I think it's important to ask, like, people are going to say this building is just like, it's not for me, it's not scalable, like it's impractical, and kind of for what we were talking about just in the beginning, it's only for hippies, man. Like, I just need to get my house up, right? So what do you say to those folks?
Well, the short answer is that we're in the middle of developing what those scaling up products and processes would look like. The movement just hasn't gone there yet, in the way that it's expressed here, and I think we're about to. So first answer would be pay attention. There's some cool stuff coming along. Second best answer is that, if you feel like this stuff is for hippies, really the best answer to that is a bunch of pictures. So I mean, a lot of what I've personally got interested in is making mixes and ways of applying these materials that are a much wider range of aesthetic application than just, what you may or may not associate with,
Great.
buildings made of mud and straw.
Thank you. And David, last question for you is, I kind of want to live in your imagination. And so maybe you could just invite us into a dream project that you have. What would it look like? How would you approach it? And where would it be?
Let's see, it'd be the ADU in my backyard that Massey's going to build and Cash is going to measure, and then everybody comes and studies it because they've kicked butt in this like really profound way, and it changes the entire trajectory of building from here on out. That's all. Just
okay.
just a little. you know, I love the idea of being able to kind of understand and measure and have the choices in front of us, and then have people sort of better angels start steering, changing the direction of the ship. And I kind of love this idea. What was the Cash? What was your term? Making externalities internal, or
yeah, making externalities internalities.
Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah, just getting people to kind of like pay attention, and kind of know what impacts we are making in our choices, and seeing if we can make sort of better choices. And so in perfect world, we're just paying a little more attention to what's going on, and we're sort of like not getting the sort of like tunnel vision business as usual thing. So that, you know, that's where I would go. I do have another plug. You know, we're doing right now, we're exploring 4 affordable housing projects. You know, so these are like 6 to 8 stories tall, and they're all exploring mass timber. And there's a carbon lens that we're looking through it, but there's a schedule lens, there's a cost lens, and they're competing on cost. So what's really nice is to sort of see this marriage of some smart engineering and industrial power being applied to, you know, something as natural as trees and timber, and efficient use of things like that. And so I do think there's a lot of promise for scale if we have some intentionality and some way of kind of measuring what some of these difficult to quantify benefits are.
And actually, you reminded me, just to add to that briefly, and maybe to add one more answer to your question, Bray. CASBA is working on a model with Arup of a multi-story straw insulated carbon sequestering building for the East Bay. And it's not an actual, we don't have a site, but the point was to make a model that was close enough to an actual building with engineering and the carbon numbers to be able to then essentially just be a resource. So it's an open source project, and we'll be finished with that report pretty soon,
Very cool.
as well as the design. So yeah, just also scaling up.
So did we all freeze, or just Ray freeze?
I think it's just Ray froze.
I think I froze.
Okay.
There we go.
Hopefully I'm back and I can close this out.
You're back. You're back.
I know. I was like, great. And my internet dies. Let me just close this out. Thank you all so much for being here. We didn't get to all of the questions, but what we're going to do is we're going to send those over to you guys and see if you guys can answer them, and we'll put it out in a follow-up blog. Cash, we want that public link from you so that our audiences can, we want some contractors, and just knowing where we can get involved. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to the audience for being here and for your great questions. I have to plug Build It Green. To continue the conversations about ADUs through the regenerative lens, please register for our next fall forum that will be on November 11th, where we'll be exploring how cities, counties, and building codes are helping to streamline policy and planning for ADUs. And you can register today at builditgreen.org. We certainly hope to see you all there. I can't say thank you enough, you guys. Thank you so much for being here. It has been a great way to spend my afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
It was great fun.
Take care.
Bye, you guys.
Bye-bye.